In the last couple of videos, you already saw me painting some of these guys, the new Bakunin nomads that Corvus Belli kindly sent me. But I still had some left, and I decided that I will do a little bit of a challenge and see if I can paint them in a single sitting. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan from PHLANSMINIATURE. Welcome back to the channel. And while I didn't manage to paint these guys in a single afternoon, I still managed to paint them faster than the time I invested to just paint the face of the previous Moira. So I would say it's still a success. I started with a very bright zenithal prime on top of the black primer because you need something bright under the contrast paint so that they become the nice saturated colors that you want to see from them. But I also didn't want to just use simply white or gray because then you lose this instant shading effect that the zenithal prime provides. So I think this is the best possible way to do this. The next step is to come up with the contrast paints that you want to use for your army, ideally matching the color scheme that you already have. Or if you are starting fresh, this is a completely new army, then obviously it's much easier because then you can just use whatever you like. But for me, I already had a couple of models painted, so I wanted to kind of match those colors. And for the black, it was the easiest choice, so I just started out with that. It's also the darkest color, so it's the safest to start with, I think. I had two choices, either Black Templar or Black Legion, and I decided for Black Legion because in my experience at least, it's way less blotchy than the other one. You can see that I actually use a pretty big brush, and this is my recommendation. As long as you actually want to go fast, use a big brush. And even if you don't want to go super fast, I wouldn't advise going with a really small one because contrast paints just flow much better if there's a lot of paint in the brush and then you just let it flow onto the model rather than trying to paint them on like normal paints. In my previous speed painting videos, many people asked me whether I add something to the paint because it seems to be flowing so smoothly, but I honestly think it's just the brush and the way I apply it because I don't actually add anything. I either just get it out of the pot directly with just the lid open, or I add something to the wet palette, a little bit of the paint on the wet palette, and then the only moisture that it gets is from the brush that remains on the brush when I cleanse it, or from the palette itself. An interesting thing to do is also to mix two contrast colors together, because sometimes even though there are a lot of them, you just can't find the exact right tone that you want, because let's say you want to match the box art to a certain degree, or you want to mix something that actually matches your army. So what you can do is you just mix two paints together to get what you want, because in this case for Cassandra's clothes I wanted to have something that is like brownish but reddish at the same time. And then for her red elements I thought that if I just use one of the reds it would be either too strong or not strong enough, so I just mixed them together a little bit and got the tone that I wanted. With some of the red paint you can also see me applying it to some large surfaces, like for example the ropes of the Moira, like the inner lining of the ropes. And in cases like this, it's especially important to use a lot of paints in my experience. Like you really need to not try to paint like with normal acrylics, but actually just like a large continuous layer of paint with a large brush on the surface is going to do you much more good than trying to paint it in painstakingly with a small brush, because then you're just going to have a lot of blotches and streaks and all that, and you're losing all the advantages that contrast actually provides. The trick really is to just apply the paint and don't touch the paint once it starts drying, because if you do that, it's the same as with normal acrylics. If you start touching the paint when it's drying, you're going to end up with streaks and blotches, but with acrylics you have a little bit more time, whereas with contrast it just dries really fast. So the trick is to move relatively fast with your brush. Just apply it without really thinking about it too much, flood the whole surface with it, move around the larger pools if it's needed, but otherwise just let it dry and deal with the next layer if needed. But normally one layer with contrast over a really bright primer should suffice. And one more important point is to paint everything, because the bright undercoat means that if you don't paint everything at this stage, you're going to end up with white dots and white parts of the model kind of shining through the paint job, which is going to ruin the whole thing. If it was just a black primer, it's much easier to deal with that, right? Because the black is going to look like shadows, but obviously a super bright white spot on the model is not going to look like a shadow, it's going to look like a mistake. Another fun thing that you can do with contrast paints is that you can use different consistencies to create different effects. Like for example on the cloak of the Sin Eater, you can see me using Basilican Grey, if I remember correctly. But instead of using it in its normal consistency, I watered it down. I didn't use any kind of medium. I don't think it's needed for this kind of stuff. I just added water to it, and it created a completely new effect where it still does the dark lining in the crevices of the cloak, but it looks much more like a dirty white than an actual proper gray. Militarum green is a good example of not an exact color match, at least to me, because I was using camouflage green before on the Moiras, on the weapons and some of the elements. And this one, Militarum green, is a little bit more on the bright side, I suppose. So it's not going to be exactly like the other models, but it's going to be close enough, I suppose. And these elements are very good examples of why contrast actually works really well on Infinity models, because of all the different elements having so many intricate details and little crevices where the contrast paint can just flow into there. And the weapons, the shin guards, different armor plates and whatnot of these guys, they are just like perfect for contrast. I still very much prefer to paint stuff with normal acrylics, but let's be honest, if I want to go fast, then contrast looks actually quite nice on these. But this also comes at a price because of how small these models are. It's just so much more likely that you're going to hit something with the brush and then some paint is going to flow in there, and you just don't want that. But it will happen, that's for sure. So a trick that you can do when this happens is either you can just wet your brush and try to remove the paint, kind of like wash it away. But with contrast, this can be tricky because if there's a lot kind of like with capillary action flowing into there, you might just stain the whole surface. So instead you can just leave it as is, and then before the next stage you can just take a little bit of whitish paint and apply it to the surface once again, which then fixes the problem easily. This is obviously a much bigger problem with translucent paints. So if the surface then later is going to receive, let's say, apothecary white on top of it, then you cannot leave anything there. It has to be really white underneath. But if you want to paint something with, let's say, Black Legion after, it's not really a big issue if you also stained it with a little bit of yellow before, because it's just going to be fully obscured. And this is what I was doing here as well. I was using a silver gray, which is very close to white. And I just painted over all the surfaces where later I knew I would use something really translucent, especially apothecary white, and make sure that there are no other colors there, no blotches are going to be showing through after. If you don't want to do this and want to go even faster, and maybe you don't trust your brush strokes to be super precise, what you can do is you can start with the colors that are translucent in the beginning of the paint job, and then go to the darker colors later, because then they would just obscure all the blotches. The side effect of this, of course, is then that if you manage to hit something with a black, it's going to be much harder to remove than if you hit something with, let's say, a yellow. One of the Achilles heels of contrast paints, though, is faces, because Guilliman flesh in itself is not exactly going to produce a beautiful face. So what I would do, I would just paint it, Guilliman flesh, use it as a base coat, but then dedicate some time to come back to the face and work on it at least a little bit, even if it's a fast paint job, because how much people like looking at faces, and not leave it just on Fireslayer flesh or Guilliman flesh or something like that, because it's not gonna look great. Another thing that is not exactly the strongest suit of contrast paints is white, unfortunately, and these guys have quite a few things white on them. But what helps us here is the zenithal prime, because the biggest issue that you usually face with the whites is that they become very flat. So if you have just a pure white primer underneath and then you apply apothecary whites, it's gonna look like flat and kind of boring. But because here we have the zenithal, which provides you with a little bit of pure whites all the way down to kind of like a grayish color, and then you apply the white, apothecary white on top of this, I think the result actually looks kind of okay. For all the cool turquoise colored glow effects on these models, I use the Thermatic Blue, which I think is the perfect color for this. It's basically exactly as I want it to look. It's extremely translucent though, which means that you have to have something really bright underneath. So what you can do is either have pure white completely under it, or you can just have pure white on the edges, and then it will look like it's glowing on the edges, which is really nice. Another thing that is a bit difficult to do with contrast paints when it comes to Infinity is the non-metallics, because for Infinity we tend to use non-metallic colors rather than true metals, which I personally prefer. I prefer the non-metallics, but unfortunately it's really difficult to do with contrast paints. So in my normal speed painting, I would be using normal true metallics and then shade them. But here I was trying to use something still contrast to represent the non-metallic colors and then applied a little bit of highlights to it later. It's not going to be as good looking as the normal non-metallic that I would be doing otherwise, but I hope it's going to still be okay and it will blend in with the rest of the army. So for everything gold, which fortunately is not that much, I used Yanden Yellow, which is kind of like a golden orange color actually, despite the name. And then for all the, let's call it steel parts, I just used Basilic Granum Gray as the base coat. At this stage, I was mostly done covering everything, which is very, very important actually, because we started with a zenithal highlight, meaning that the whole model was mostly whitish. And that means that if you leave something without covering it, it's going to look, well, white, right? And it's going to shine through any other color. Because if it's just black, let's say it's a black primer, it will look like it's a shadow. And that's fine most of the time, but nobody is going to mistake a white blotch or a white dot for a shadow. So make sure that everything is covered. And that you can achieve either by applying enough color overall. So as I said in the very beginning of the video, you can kind of use a lot of the color to flood the surface properly. Then it will flow into all of these little nooks and crannies. Or you can do what I did here in the end and dedicate a little bit of time to make sure that you blackline the model at the places where you think there is not enough black in the shadows or where something is shining through a little bit. Now this is taking a little bit of time away from your speed painting, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I failed my challenge and I couldn't just do them in a single afternoon. But for a nice end result, I think it's actually worth doing. And just when you're finished, when you feel that everything is fine, just go through the model again and see if you want to apply a little bit of color here and there, or maybe you want to water down a little bit of Black Templar and then just apply it as kind of like a wash over some of the surfaces. Contrast paints are designed to actually do this and flow into these crevices, create some dark lining between different elements. But not all of them are saturated enough to do this, and even the ones that are not going to produce as nice a result as you actually manually doing it. So depending on how much time you want to invest, you might want to still dedicate a little bit of time to this. So at this stage, you could just call it a day and say that all the colors are on the model and everything is fine, and that's perfectly okay as well. But if you want to make them a little bit nicer, even if this is a speed painting process, you can still go and select some colors to highlight. Like for example, there's a lot of white on these models, there's a lot of black, and there's a lot of red, and let's say green. So you can just take these 4 colors and apply a single edge highlight for all of them, and just that is going to transform the model quite a bit and make it so much nicer. The nice thing about this is that you're basically done anyway, right? So it's up to you if you feel like, okay, this is okay for me, I am done at this stage, or you can just go indefinitely and add more detail, add more edge highlights, little scratches here and there, stuff like that. It's entirely up to you. And in my case, I decided to do exactly this. I worked mostly on the black clothes first, and I added edge highlights almost everywhere, and then some on the non-metallics as well with almost the same gray, because I already had some pure whitish color, the silver gray if I remember correctly, on my wet palette. Sometimes I mixed in a little bit into the gray so that I got a more like brighter highlight, which I used to distinguish some of the non-metallics and some of the top edges on the surfaces. Then I used Wild Rider Reds to highlight all the red elements on the models, because they are meant to pop on these models, right? They are the accent colors. They need to be standing out from all the rest of the model. So I think at least this needs a little bit of highlighting. You can even do little scratches here and there on the cloaks, because you want to make them a little bit worn and not so uniform looking as well. For all the greens, I use Creek Khaki because I wanted to get close to what I have on the other Moiras, and I think this color achieves that because it's kind of yellowish. And once again, I just used it to loosely highlight the edges, and that was already enough. And finally, I used the silver gray that I already had on my palette to highlight all the edges of the whites so that they don't look so boring and they stand out a little bit more, but also on the non-metallics so that they are distinguished a bit from the blacks, which use mostly the same grays. This was the models done except the faces, which, as I said before, you have to dedicate a little bit of time to finish off, because if you just leave them on Gilliman Flash, they will look even more hideous than my end result in the end. Obviously, you shouldn't dedicate hours to just painting the faces if you're speed painting, but don't forget that faces are very important. People's eyes are drawn to them. So I think the minimum that you should do is paint in the eyes and highlight some of the most prominent areas like the cheekbones, the nose, the jaw, this kind of stuff. And after 6-7 hours of painting, this is the end result. I don't think any of these guys would win competitions individually, but together as a group, they look kinda cool and they match quite well with the models that I already had. But what do you guys think? Is it worth painting Infinity models with contrast paint, speed painting them, or do you prefer to spend more time on the models and use normal acrylics? Thank you for watching. I hope you liked the video and you found it useful. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. See you in the next one.